Okay. One of the ways that I have seen over the past 5 years documentary films changing is the ability to get me to pay closer attention to it with some movement. A lot of documentary films deal with subject matter that was from a time when there were no moving images, there was no film, there was nothing. So you have no way to move things other than panning across an image or zooming in and out of it or something like that. So what some filmmakers have started to use is this effect, and I don't know if you can see that very well, where that one head is tilting and moving. And I'm basically using the puppet pin tool then to create this movement. And I've seen this done rather effectively because it gets me to pay attention to the part of the image that's the most important, or the character, or the whatever it is in that. Brings it to life a little tiny bit. So what I want to show then briefly is how I put this together. And I am going to modify the project that's listed on Canvas to include something like this, where you're dealing with an older image where you wouldn't have any possibilities of having film. I also added a blur to this character in the foreground right over here on the left-hand side, because I don't really want you to pay attention to that person. I want the focus on this person right here, okay? The guy leaning over here to talk to Mr. Carnegie. Okay, so in order to do that, I set myself up this way. I have gone over to Photoshop because I find it's a lot easier to sort of take these things apart there. So what I have done is I have the entire image, and I cut out the guy on the left side, and I cut out the head, made them separate layers, named them accordingly, and then filled in behind them so that when the head moves, I'm not exposing a big white space or something like that. And I found it's easier for me to set this thing up this way. And I could cut out any one of these figures, but I thought I'd just limit it to this. I saved that as a Photoshop file. And then I'm going to jump back over here to After Effects. When I bring this file in and I import it, what I need to do is to make sure that when I select this file, this Photoshop file, I don't import it as footage. I import it as a composition, and I retain the layers so that when it comes in, I will still have the three parts that I used to make this. Okay, I've already brought it in, so I'm not going to bring it in, and it's right over here within my projects folder, and here it is, because I have the background, I have the head, and I have the guy on the left. So I have these three different parts that I have to then put back together, and I put them back together here in this composition. So I have these three parts. So I've set myself up for what I need to do to make this thing work. Now, what I'm going to actually do is I'll take and I've already put some pins in this guy. So let me zoom in on this a little tiny bit. And when I come into this head layer and I click it open, I can see that now I have these puppet pins. They are indicated by this small little yellow dot right there. And how I get those is using this tool right up here, which is my pin tool. Okay, and I can add as many as I want. Okay, but there's two that are key. One is the point at which it will rotate, and that's this lower one, and this upper one, so I can tilt the whole head to the left and to the right. As soon as you add a pin, it automatically clicks on the little stopwatch, so it adds a keyframe. You don't have to do anything else to that. But that allows you then to move this head from that point. But you can also see that if you start adding too many of these, what you end up with is just weird distortion. So in this case, I just wanted 2 points, this one and this one, to move that head. And then I simply moved out in my timeline, and I can move this pin as much as I want. I can tilt his head, and you can see I start to expose my what I did to get this to happen. But that allows me to make that motion, okay? So that's really simple on just a simple image, and it's just a matter of adding a pin. And like I said, they come in as a pin thing down here in your timeline, And you can see that it actually comes in under mesh and then deform, and you have puppet pin 1 and puppet pin 2. And as soon as I put it in, it adds the keyframe, and then I can just start moving. So that's quite simple. But I do want you to demonstrate this effect in a short piece that you make with After Effects. Now the next one is a little bit different, because this one I want you to start with an Illustrator file, okay, of your making. It could be anything really simple. And in this case, I actually have an Illustrator file that looks more like this, where I have all these multiple fish and a background and all that sort of thing. It is a layered Illustrator file, and so I did bring it in that way, but what I want to start with is the basics of just this fish all by itself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start a new composition, and I'll simply bring that fish in, place it on here, and I'll show you the wrong tool. Sorry. So let me resize this. This is a little bit too big. Scale this down and get it down to a size that's a little bit more appropriate for what we need to do. And I want this thing to move then from here across my screen, and I want parts of it to move. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put in my motion. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go into my transform. I'm going to start my position there and then move in my timeline to the end, put in another keyframe, and I'll just put my fish over here. Creates this long, nice thing which allows me to create a bend in it. So my fish will move along this timeline, along that line. So I'm going to go to about here, and here's where I'm going to start adding some pins. I'm going to add a pin closer to the body, a pin out towards the end, a pin closer to the body, and one closer to the end of the fin, let's say. Then what I do is I simply come in and I start moving these things. And it's not really a frame by frame, because it does the frames in between. And I can just start moving this thing. If you guys have questions, just don't hesitate to interrupt me. And I can simply then start creating that motion, going back and forth, and I can push this in. It does tend to distort other parts of the body, but I'm not really concerned. Okay, and if I just go out to the end, get closer to that, and I can put in as many as I want. I can always move the keyframes later if I want to put them closer together, make the action faster or slower. And that's the end of it. Now when I go back to the beginning and play this, I have this fish. First time through is a little slow and stuttery because it's trying to render the in-between frames, but that gives me then that motion. Okay? And you can see it's pretty smooth, and it actually looks fairly realistic. What doesn't look realistic is it's not tracking to that path perfectly. So often I would go into my rotation and maybe rotate this fish a little bit so it's a little bit closer to following that path. So that's quite simple to do. It doesn't quite follow it perfectly, but it's not too bad. And it feels pretty smooth actually. Then what you can do is you could actually put this all together, add in your background, add in everything else that you want, have your fish. Because remember, I can put an After Effects file into another After Effects file. I can build this thing up. I can do the animation separate, bring it in and put them together, which allows me to do that. And then if I wanted, I could add bubbles, I could add whatever. So think about what you might want to animate. It can be anything. But with an Illustrator file, make sure you do build it in layers. You have a background layer, a sky, whatever. And so that you've built it up in pieces that you're able to easily manipulate once you get it in here. Because you'll bring it in and you'll have then these multiple parts to it. And then you can simply place them where you want, size them accordingly, and go from there. If you are starting from scratch, I already had produced these years ago. Make sure that you are setting up an Illustrator file list, an appropriate size for video. And they do have sizes already pre-set up in Illustrator for that. The other thing you can do and I'm not going to really cover this today, but just to bring it to your attention that another technique that I've seen a lot of is adding that third dimension into something that might just be rather boring. And that is with turning images that I have like this into three-dimensional objects, which allow me to add a camera that can zoom in on it, and it can retain the depth of field so that these things come in and out of focus as they come closer to the camera. On the left-hand side here, this red triangle is my camera, which you may already know. But this is another technique that I've seen a lot of with documentary films where they just had still images and they actually turned it into something that was a lot more engaging. And I think that's what you're really going after, is to create something that people will pay attention to. Because the last thing you want is somebody just to sit at this thing and you've got 3 images and they just sit there, they don't do anything. And I zone out and I don't pay any attention. So if you have an interest in this or you have used this, use it, okay? Because you can add this type of thing to what you have happening here or here, where you simply have a fish, and I could zoom in on it. There may be some limitations as far as the puppet
Hey,
pin.
Dan,
Yes.
could you explain how to make the camera?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
It's actually pretty simple. I'll just start a new composition, okay? And what I'm going to do then is I'm on here, I'm just going to create one simple shape, okay? So there's my shape. And what I'm going to do then is I am going to go to Layer, New, Camera. It automatically gives me this palette here where I can choose a lot of range of different types of lenses. So I went with something that's a little bit more wide angle, a 28mm lens, and say okay. That then creates, and this is a little zoomed in here, okay, over here on this screen, that creates the camera right here, okay? And that simply allows me to zoom in and out of my object. But my object at the moment has not been turned into a 3D object. So over here on my timeline, I have to click on this little tiny cube, which turns that into a 3-dimensional object, okay? And what that does is that allows me to move this in relationship to that camera, either closer to it or farther away. I can also move the camera just as I would any other object. And you can see I'm moving the camera closer to the object, which means I'm zooming in on it, okay? Have you worked with cameras this way, John?
I never have, no.
Okay. I think this is a great way to add a lot of animation to your piece and a lot of movement, because you can create something like, I think I had one other one like, or did I throw it away? Here it is, where I had this happening. So here's where we began. The balls here are closer to the camera. And let me explain a little bit about the camera in that, I meant to zoom in on this one, sorry. The camera has this triangular shape, okay? This is where objects will be focused on this lighter line. This is like the front of the camera. So anything that approaches that line right there comes into focus. So as I move through this, you can see the camera's moving. It got closer to this one object, which is going to be actually probably behind this big yellow ball, which is, I believe, this one. Okay, and then we can just zoom through. So you can do, you can fly through space, basically, because all of these little round shapes could be like stars or nebula or something like that, or anything else. So a camera allows you to fly through that space. That's why I'm saying with something like this, I can go from just this flat feeling of nothing to a sense of things coming into focus, grabbing your attention, and then fading out and another piece coming in. And I don't have to move any of these things. I'm simply moving the camera. If you want me to go into more depth on this, I can do something on Thursday. Would that be helpful?
The only other question I have for is, how do you adjust the focus? Like if you want a shallower or deeper depth of field? But other than that, I think I get it.
Yeah. No, it's really simple because when you click open the part of the timeline here under camera, so you have camera options, you have to turn on depth of field. You have to choose here focus distance and aperture. Okay, and it works just like a film camera. So if you have your aperture open really large, you know that you're going to have a shallow depth of field. Okay, and it defaults to off as far as the depth of field. And you have to turn these things on here: depth of field, focal distance, and aperture. And then from there, it's really simple. The only thing you have to be careful of is that under the composition settings, okay, when you bring this up, you have to make sure your 3D renderer is not set to Cinema 4D, because it will not preview and show you the depth of field, but you have to have it on the classic 3D. I also found under options, I needed to set this shadow map resolution to something greater than comp size to get my blurriness, the depth of field, to actually show perfectly. Okay, I ran into a little problem and I'm not sure why that was, but it was very simple. Simply to go into the composition settings, check to make sure under 3D render I have classic 3D, go to options, and then choose. I just went to the max because I really wanted it to show that blurriness. I have not exported this to find out exactly what it looks like, but that's a couple things you need to pay attention to. Does that explain it pretty well?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Okay. I definitely want you to be able to do this effect where you are moving at least a portion of an image in some way and not distorting it. Like I said, if you put in too many pins, you can distort it. And I definitely want you to be able to show that you can animate a piece of Illustrator art, okay? And you can make it as complex as this one, where you have all this stuff happening. And I could put in a whole bunch of these fish if I wanted to. But it doesn't have to be overly complex. It can be as short as 30 seconds for each of those. And that's really what I'm going after for this particular project, where I want you to use After Effects and the puppet pin thing. Once we're done with this, the rest of the term then is for everybody to be producing the films that they want to. I won't have any other techniques necessarily. I will show things that people need to know, and I will be your sounding board for ideas on what you're shooting and why you're shooting. I'm going to be, wanting you to focus in on that. But for now, we're just going to do this puppet pin. It's actually kind of fun, because you can really make some beautiful, simple animations with your Illustrator art. Okay. So any other questions on that? I will post this